Now that we've created the table in our database using Entity Framework, the next thing we can do is create a repo pattern for aircrafts. So right now, I'm just simply looking at a interface for a flight repository. All of our repositories have interfaces to specify what a repository should be expecting. So for example, a flight has several get all functions determining different bits of data given to it. Get flight, add, update, and delete. For this example, we won't create an interface for the aircraft repo. We'll just go ahead and actually create the repo itself, which might look a little bit something more like this, where we have these functions and it's actually specifying what happens inside of them. So as you can see, I actually already have an aircraft repo folder. So we're just going to go ahead and add oh, whoopsie. Let's go ahead and delete that. Try that one more time. There we go. Aircraft repo. Fantastic. Okay. And there's a couple of things that we're going to want to be using. So much like before, we'll want to use openair.data.model. Models. We'll be wanting to be using system. We're going to want to be using collections, text, threading tasks, using system.threading.tasks, because all of our repositories are asynchronous in order to keep the user interface up to date as quickly as possible without getting bogged down with the repository details. We'll be using system.link, which is just a bunch of commands that allow us to actually interact with the repository or the database using SQL functions. And then finally, we'll be using Microsoft.entityframework core. Oh, didn't like the way I did that apparently. Entity Framework core. Perfect. So those are the libraries that we're going to need. We are going to go ahead and just say namespace data. We're going to go ahead and make this class public. And then we can start creating our database. Now, I think it'll be a little bit helpful if I go ahead and put this example on the board as well. Let me go ahead and pin this down, and as well as this. Because many of our databases or many of our repo patterns are very similar to each other. So in our case, we are also going to want a private read-only variable that is the OpenAir DB context. And we can just go ahead and also call it DB. So this is the thing that we'll actually be interacting with in order to work with the repository. So much like flight, we're also going to want a constructor, aircraft repo, taking an OpenAir DB context called DB. And we can go ahead and say that this DB is equal to the DB that we were given when we were creating this repo. Perfect. And now all we will do in this example is create a function that can asynchronously add an aircraft to the repository, the database. So we're going to go ahead and say public async, because our tasks are async. We're going to specify that this function is going to return a task, which is just how C# and Entity Framework make working asynchronously easier, is that all of our asyncs are tasks. And we'll say that we want to add an aircraft, and we'll call it aircraft. And every aircraft also needs a pilot, so we're going to need a pilot as well. And in this function, we're going to go ahead and say pilot p is equal to await. Anytime that you're working with async tasks, you're going to want to use await db.pilots.where. And this is where we get into the link commands that we had talked about a little bit earlier. We've seen them in a few other examples going through adding this aircraft entity to our project. But it's the p equals arrow p.email id is equal to pilot.email id. So this is saying go to my database, my table of pilots, and go through all the pilots and give me the pilot where the pilot that I'm currently looking at, its email ID matches the pilot that I was given, matches its email ID. And then to make this work, we're just going to say first or default async. There we go. And now that we have that pilot, we'll want to make sure that we actually have it. So we'll say not equals null. And then we can go ahead and say that aircraft dot pilot, dot pilot is equal to the pilot that we were given. We'll have aircraft pilot dot pilot email ID is equal to pilot dot email ID. And then we're going to go ahead and await db dot aircraft. So we're going to the aircraft table, add async, which is a function of framework. And we're going to go ahead and add the aircraft. And then the last thing that we'll do is that we'll await db.save changes async. So we added the aircraft entity, but now we actually want to save the database so that it stores that information. And that is all you need in order to actually add a flight. We do something very similar with, we have just created the function to add an aircraft, which is very similar to how we add a flight. We still want to set up or get a list of these DBs. We make sure that there's no conflicts. We add the flight once we are sure that it's okay, and then we save the database once we've actually added the flight. Add the aircraft, save the database. And now we can go ahead and move on to actually testing this repo pattern to make sure that it's working properly. So now that we have this repo pattern, let's go ahead and go back to our Solution Explorer. And we're going to add a new system test. So we have flight repository test, pilot repository test, all the route test, the singleton test. So we're just going to go ahead and, I meant to right click and add a new item that is going to be aircraft. Make sure I spell it right. Yep, aircraft repository system test. We can go ahead and add it. And then there we go. Now, the things that we'll need in order to make this work are similar to the ones that we needed in the repository. So we're going to be using Microsoft.entityframework core. We're going to be using NUnit, which is our testing framework. In fact, we're actually going to be even using .framework. We want using openair.data, using openair.data.models, using system collection, using system.link, using system.threading.task. Fantastic. Oh, and then just a semicolon. So those are libraries that we're going to be using in this case. We're going to go ahead and make this a public class, system repository. And we're going to want to set up some variables for our repository system test. And I'll actually just go ahead and open up a simple repository system test like route repository. And a lot of these are very similar. We have the OpenDB context with route repo and route. And we have the setup, we have tests, we have a teardown. A lot of this is explained in the system test and unit test videos that you can find on the YouTube channel for OpenAir. So I won't go too much into what setup is and what test is and everything like that. We're just going to go through an example and actually get it set up and running. Why tasks? There we go. Okay, so we're going to create a private OpenAir DB context. Call it _context. We're going to create a private pilot just because every flight or every aircraft needs a pilot. So odds are we're going to need to create one to add to the database. We're going to want private aircraft. And then we can go ahead and start going into the actual system testing. So we're going to go ahead and set up the setup. And the way that we do that is using the keyword setup. We're going to go ahead and say public async. A lot of these are going to be async. In fact, all of them are. Setup. Async task. There we go. And we're going to need, perfect. What is that? Async lacks await. Oh, it's just because we haven't added an await to it. So it knows that it's async, but it doesn't see any awaits inside of the function, so it's just a little bit confused. So we'll just go ahead and go along with the setup. We're going to say that single or context is equal to singleton test setup dot instance dot get. So this will go to our singleton class and actually get us an instance of the context of the database. We're going to say that pilot is equal to a new pilot, giving it values such as email ID is equal to flight tests at gmail.com. The name is going to be test pilot. And we'll go ahead and set the PWD equal to just A. Okay, great. And now we go ahead and we await context.pilots, specifically the table. So we're going to the context, going to the pilots table, and we're going to add async the pilot we just created. Great. And now we'll say underscore context dot entry pilot dot state is equal to entity state added. That way the actual database knows, or the context knows, that this value, this entry has been added. And then we await underscore context dot save changes async. Fantastic. And that's it for our setup. Now we can go into the single test that we'll have for this, because we only have one functionality in our repo. So we're going to go ahead and say test so that NUnit knows that we're creating a test. And we'll say public async task test whether aircraft is added. And like I said in the YouTube video that goes over the tests, they essentially go in an arrange, act, and assert pattern. So we're going to go ahead and arrange by creating our repo, our instance of our repo. We'll say new aircraft repo, giving it the context that our repo needs. Then we'll say that aircraft is equal to a new aircraft. And that value has aircraft name is equal to test aircraft. Perfect. Await repo dot add aircraft pilot. This is the acting portion of this test. So we are going to go ahead and use our repo to add the aircraft. And then we'll say var result is equal to await underscore context dot aircraft dot where, using our link commands. A is equal to a dot pilot email ID is equal to pilot dot email ID, and a dot aircraft name is equal to aircraft dot aircraft name. And like our other link command, we'll say first or default. One second. Yes, okay, first or default async. There we go. So we add the aircraft using the repository pattern, and then we use the link commands to get us an instance of some object where where the object has a pilot that matches the pilot ID that we gave it, and the aircraft matches the aircraft name that we gave it. So that is the act portion of this, and now we go ahead and we assert. So we ask if the value that we just got from this command is not null. So we check to see if result is not null. If it is null, that means that we could not find the aircraft and the repo did not properly add the aircraft. And before we go into testing all this, we'll have to do a little bit with the DB context, which we'll get into in a minute. So when you're writing these, our recommendation is use test-driven development such that you test to make sure that A, your actual test doesn't work, like make it show that if you do it wrong, it will fail your test. And then get it so that it works, just to make sure that you're not passing a test that you think is what you're testing for, but really it's not. That's more on just general good testing practices anyway. So now that we've got the setup and the test, we can go ahead and tear down our actual system test. So we'll say public async task, and we'll just go ahead and we'll call it cleanup. It's a little upset that there's no async, but that's fine. We'll say underscore context dot aircraft. We're going to that table dot remove. We want to leave our tables as clean as we found them. Want to remove the aircraft that we had just found. Underscore that's a minus. Underscore context dot entity aircraft dot state is equal to, you might have guessed it, entity state dot deleted, and then we await underscore context dot save changes async, and then we do the same thing for pilots. We go to context dot pilots dot remove pilot. I do see an error up there on my entity thing. I'll get to that in a second. We have, actually, let me just go ahead and see if I can. Does not contain, oh, did I spell it wrong? Oh, it's not entity, it's entry. My bad. The entry has been changed. Underscore context dot entry pilot dot state is equal to entity state dot deleted. Let me go ahead and add a. Oh, and let me go ahead and actually spell deleted correctly. There we go. And then await context dot save changes. And in a moment, we'll go ahead and do what we need to do in order to actually test this and see the test run and see that it passes. But for now, that's all you need to do in order to actually set up a repository test. We have the setup, we have all the tests that we need, and then we have a teardown to leave the context as clean as we had found it. Now, the last thing that we're going to want to do before we actually run our tests is update the database and add a migration. So the process for doing this is that we're going to want to go to our SQL Object Explorer. We're going to want to go to our local DB. We're going to want to delete our instances of our database because now the tables and such have changed. Oh, yeah. Delete that. Fantastic. And then we go over to our Solution Explorer and we actually go ahead and we delete the entire migrations folder. Right now I already have a migration in here, but we're just actually going to go ahead and delete the entire folder. And then we're going to go to our Package Manager console, and I've actually already tested this. So we're going to go ahead and add migration. I'm going to call it aircraft or aircraft. It adds the migration, and now we can go ahead and Entity Framework Core Update Database. And if you're curious as to where I got these commands from, you can go to our context README, and that explains in pretty great detail what the migrations are doing and how they function with our program. So we wait for this to update. And if you got all the way to done and nothing went wrong, then you're in the clear. And now what we can go ahead and do is we can see, not to spoil it, but our test did work. We have aircraft repository system test in our list of tests now. So we can go ahead and click run all tests. And as you can see, we passed all of our tests, including our new test whether aircraft was actually added. And that is the summary of how we can add an entity to the database and have the project kind of revolve around that new entry.